we're going to talk about learning and learning about learning. Since last year or so, I've really focused on a lot of new skill acquisition, right? So big part of improving my abilities as a business owner has come from learning about teaching other people, right? So improving the ability to actually transfer knowledge that I have to other people, as well as really building out my skill set as far as like software development, all those kinds of things. Not that I'm actually building anything complicated, but at the stage of business that South Loop Strength and Conditioning is at, it's been important for me to actually learn a decent amount of development skills in order to really figure out what we're doing as a business. So that's something that I've sort of focused on personally from a learning perspective. And I will say that, podcasts I did this past year, one of my favorite ones was actually with Scott Young, author of Ultra Learning, which is a great book about learning. So if this type of thing interests you, I would definitely recommend checking out his book as well as potentially that podcast. And, I've always been someone who is interested in information and kind of has a collector mindset to searching stuff out, looking up bands online and digging through their thanks lists and trying to figure out where their influences are. And, if I like an author, going back in the archive and reading their early short stories and figuring out what authors influenced them and tracing the roots of a genre and all that kind of stuff. So that's been something that has always been at least partially part of my just like personality. But I used to have a pretty bad attitude toward learning, especially in school. A lot of people I think have stories about that of being a, bratty teenager and not really reacting terribly well to assignments in school. And I just really did not put forth a solid effort, I would say, when I was in school, and kind of looking back at my efforts is definitely something that I regret, right? Just thinking about, man, I had all these opportunities to just legitimately learn this stuff, and I would just kind of put forth a relatively poor, bad attitude laced teenage angst ridden, poor effort. And that's something that really bums me out. So kind of thinking about that and thinking about my position now where I am attempting to teach other people and develop my own skill set in a lot of different areas simultaneously has got me thinking a lot about learning and teaching, what that looks like. Because I think it's one of the biggest superpowers that you can develop, right, is the skill of learning and the skill of teaching, because you can essentially just compound everything that you're doing. If you're able to learn more effectively, then you're able to level up more quickly. If you're able to teach more effectively, especially if you're in any sort of organization, then you're able to not just learn yourself, but actually have your entire organization learn. So this is something that is really, really important and very, very powerful. So it's something that I've tried to improve on and definitely have changed my attitude on, right? That, there's that inherent pleasure of finding things out and digging into stuff that you're interested in, but just actually having a more systematic way of approaching stuff and saying, oh, I'm going to really figure out how to learn this thing is something that I really wish I had just taken on much earlier. And people always say, oh, I don't have any regrets. Like, dude, this is something that I strongly, strongly regret. So figured I'd ramble about that for a while, and hopefully some people can take away some useful information from that. So if I think about learning and teaching in particular, I think that one of the most important things that I've realized is that people need to be solving a problem, right? So that if you are explaining something to someone and they don't necessarily have anywhere that they can slot that information into their own experience, then they're going to have a very hard time actually taking that in and then applying it anywhere. So if we think about this in the context of, say, coaches meetings at South Loop, which is something that I, think about regularly. So it's a very tangible example for me. We used to do coaches meetings where I would do a lot of talking. I would do a lot of explaining, and I would say, oh, great, I read this article, or I went to this course, or I discovered this thing in my program design for athletes, and I really want everyone to understand that. And we would talk about it and put it on the board and draw diagrams, and I would give a lecture. And everyone would hopefully be at least somewhat entertained and interested. But the amount of actual transfer of knowledge there was very, very, very low, right? That people could potentially feel like, oh, that was kind of a good talk, and that was interesting. And maybe that sort of, tickled some sort of entertainment receptor in my brain. But the actual effects of those kinds of lectures were very, very, underwhelming, let's say. So essentially something that we figured out, and I've talked about this in the past as far as Socratic questioning, is that if people are thinking about a problem, especially a problem that they know that they have, that they've encountered in their own experiences, then they can actually take an information and then apply it, right? So in the context of a coaches meeting, rather than being more of like a top down, all right, guys, like we're going to learn about this type of breathing and this type of rib cage positioning and this type of energy systems training and all that stuff that, maybe I'm thinking about. What we've done instead is sort of opened up the floor for people to bring up problems or challenges that they've had in their coaching, right? So like, what is something that someone has struggled with recently? Maybe it was a particularly tricky movement issue. Maybe someone has a video of an athlete doing something bizarre that they couldn't figure out how to fix. Maybe it was an emotional reaction from an athlete and, some drama occurring during attempted coaching. And these types of things are great opportunities to then figure out how to actually, impart knowledge that might be helpful in those scenarios. So when we think about coaches coming to meetings prepared with problems, they've already sort of turned this thing over in their head, right? They've already said, you know what, this didn't go exactly the way I wanted to. I tried this and it didn't work. Maybe I could have tried that. So they already have a bunch of ideas kind of connected and networked around this problem. And based upon that, if we then have a discussion, especially with other coaches then chiming in, right? Because each of these other coaches has probably experienced something somewhat similar, right? If there's someone who, let's say, has a particularly pernicious mobility issue and they're squatting, has a hard time getting all the way down. Let's say there's an athlete who does not listen to feedback and just kind of looks at the coach, seemingly hears them, and disregards their feedback on movement or weight selection. Or let's say an athlete doesn't learn how to pace themselves, that they're always going too fast and blowing up, and having a bad workout based upon that every coach has experienced something that kind of looks like that. So when someone brings that up, every coach is very quickly able to, tie that story to their own reference experiences, which they probably have also thought about, experienced, tried some solutions, maybe had some success, maybe had some struggles. And based upon that, again, there's all these ideas already connected. There's already sort of like a network of thoughts and attempted solutions, and maybe some attempted solutions that were, proposed by other coaches, or maybe you found something on Instagram or an article or whatever. So based upon that, this discussion becomes very, very productive because coaches are able to connect abstract ideas about how to potentially fix something or what a mechanism might be for difficulty in mobility in a certain position. And then those abstract ideas then become very tangible because it's easy to plug them into an already existing framework surrounding a problem. So in these scenarios, my role is not necessarily to come in and be like, oh, well, don't you guys know about this certain scapular positioning idea? And haven't you ever heard of this breathing drill that can realign someone's rib cage so that their scapula can go where they're supposed to? And don't you guys know about blood flow in and out of muscles and how oxygen saturation affects performance? Like, yes, that stuff is all relevant. And there is potentially a time and a place for me to come in and actually deliver that information. But instead, I want coaches actually thinking about these problems, trying to figure out where the actual missing piece is. And then if they are able to come up with solutions on their own, they're much more likely to be able to implement them, right? Because it's something that they came up with on their own. They're already bought into it. And then they have this idea. And then if, let's say, we're not actually able to get to something that I would consider to be a valuable and appropriate solution, or, I think there's a big missing piece that just isn't quite getting touched on. Yeah, I can be an obnoxious Socratic questioning person, asking leading questions and trying to get people to go in the direction that I want them to. But at that point, even if I do have to come in and say, well, listen, I'm going to just sort of now talk and tell everyone what I think they should do. Like I said before, there's this huge network of thoughts and potential solutions and caveats and things that have been tried in the past that have already sort of been laid down in the discussion. So abstract ideas then are hooked into this very tangible, real life thought process. And the actual transfer of that knowledge into future behavior becomes much, much, much higher based upon that. Right. And this is something that I've had a lot of success with in terms of my own learning as well. Right. That if I am someone who is, potentially more able to read a book and actually apply the ideas from that, or listen to a podcast and apply the ideas from that, it's because I've developed the habit of thinking through how the information actually relates to ideas that I've already thought about, right? I've already thought through a bunch of problems related to, in this case, movement scenarios or energy systems development or management of people or development of business, or even just more abstract ideas about stuff that I don't necessarily know a whole lot about, but I've collected notes on from other podcasts or other books or things like that. And so when new information is presented, there's already a network that information can hook into, which then makes it something that is actually actionable, or that helps sort of modify the overall flowchart of information and ideas that, pretty much everyone is using to make decisions and sort of think through concepts. So related to that, we have something that I've kind of mentioned in that previous discussion on the coaches meetings, is this blending between theory and practice, right? That it's not all about only doing practical stuff, nor is it all about just quote unquote book learning. That most things that people care about are a combination of both this very theoretical, abstract knowledge about how something may work and sort of like school learning, book learning, etc., as well as very tangible, actionable, real life takeaways that need to be done or performed in order to be kind of like properly experienced, right? So if we think about something like, let's say a sport specific scenario, right? There's all kinds of classic examples of people attempting to improve their performance in a sport based upon doing drills or watching film or reading the explanations or listening to explanations from previous great players about how they should do certain things. And while all that stuff can actually be helpful, let's use an example of something like soccer, which I do have some experience in, right? You can do all of this stuff, but it's not actually going to be necessarily that helpful in a game scenario where the thing that dictates whether or not you're going to be able to do what you want to do is whether or not someone else can stop you from doing it, right? So you have this sort of unpredictable, well, not totally unpredictable, but this other agent who is acting against you to stop you from doing what you want to do. And it doesn't matter how many times you've done a specific drill of dribbling around cones or passing around cones, or how much film you've watched of certain types of runs being made, or potentially even great players doing stuff, in matches, that your skill of reading and reacting to a game scenario that is going to be somewhat unpredictable is just a totally different skill that needs to be developed in and of itself. And if that skill is actually developed, then potentially this type of theory can actually be applicable for you because you have the baseline skill of being able to read and react to a real life scenario. And then on top of that, you can layer in this more abstract theory-based stuff, or potentially you can utilize drills to work on specific scenarios that you know that you struggle with, right? To stick with the soccer example, let's say that you potentially struggle with taking a ball out of the air and getting a shot off, right? So if you know that this is something that for you is a particular challenge, through experience, then you can say, great, I'm going to develop a set of drills to focus on this exact skill. And then hopefully through the repetition of those drills, potentially then adding in drills that do have some element of unpredictability, either through how the ball is played or potentially there's a defensive player, then you can hopefully stack those skills up enough that it is actually transferring over into a game scenario. Similarly, with more abstract concepts, right, or something that isn't totally sport or game based, you can run into issues where you have all this abstract knowledge, to go back to a coaching example about mobility and stability patterns or proper program design. But in reality, when you're attempting to coach an individual, the actual thing that's happening is you have to deal with the emotions of this other person in front of you, the sort of chaotic social situation of being in a gym with a lot of different things going on, someone else trying to get your attention, the music being too loud, the person who you're coaching being emotional and not reacting well to that. And all of that stuff is going to sort of preclude you from even utilizing the information that you have, right? So we have this transfer issue that's very, very challenging to figure out. How do we actually get theory to be applicable in practice? And the reality is that we find a blend of these two things. Like I mentioned with that soccer drill, if we are able to figure out what becomes a problem for us through this regular actual practice of the skill that we're doing, whether that's coaching or playing guitar or writing software programs or playing some sort of sport, then we can think about, oh, you know what, this is the type of scenario that I struggle with. But it's not enough to then just go and abstractly deal with that type of information. We then have to attempt to apply what we've learned in scenarios that allow us to apply it without getting too bogged down or distracted by other things that are going to disrupt us. And ideally, that sort of constant back and forth between actual practical application and attempting to integrate theory and dig into it more then facilitates us creating this very robust skill set, right? And that I don't know that I have a perfect prescription for this. I have some awareness of this process of wanting to bounce back and forth between these two areas as much as possible. And I really think that this is something that I would love to know more about, and I would love to actually develop a better framework for understanding when it's appropriate to focus on theory, when it's appropriate to focus on practice, and how to potentially bridge the gap between the two. Because even having that theoretical idea of saying, okay, we want to do something in real life, figure out where a potential problem is, focus on drills to improve it, then attempt to gradually integrate those drills into the actual practice of a skill. That's still really, really hard. And there's still these huge gaps where, let's say we're talking about some sort of muscle up progression, and we recognize that someone has restrictions in shoulder extension, meaning the ability to actually catch themselves in the receiving position of the muscle up. You can do all this stuff to improve their shoulder extension and just get absolutely no transfer whatsoever to the real life skill of the muscle up. Similarly, in coaching, you can have someone who potentially struggles to, let's say, handle pushback from athletes without either shutting down or being overly reactive. And you can focus on all these different scenarios, give them theoretical frameworks for how to think about it, expose them to some types of communication that might be more helpful in terms of dealing with athletes who are a little bit more difficult. You can role play these scenarios, etc. But then as soon as it happens in real life and there's emotions involved, it all goes out the window. So, that actual bridging the gap there is still something that I really don't feel super great about. But it's something that, just being aware of it hopefully facilitates having some insight there. And again, just like any other skill, just constantly touching on it and then potentially experiencing some breakthroughs there, and also continuing to read and learn about the theory of the transfer problem in skill acquisition will hopefully give some more insight into what that actually looks like. And then based upon that as well, I do think it's also really important to have varied scenarios in terms of practicing skills, right? That we see this, again, in the sort of like sport skill acquisition scenarios and literature where people are often much better at applying skills and have a much more robust understanding of those skills if they do them in scenarios that are more chaotic, right? So that people become actually better at the specific skill of doing exactly what they're doing if they practice it over and over and over again in a very tight scenario, and they actually get better at it more quickly. But that skill is more fragile and is not as transferable as people who do messier practice, potentially do more like quote unquote scrimmage types of scenarios, etc. That those people don't get as good as quickly at that specific skill, but that skill is much more robust because it's been applied in a variety of scenarios. So I think we can see something similar with, coaching or software development or improvising on guitar or something where, you can get really, really good at playing a specific riff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have the capacity to layer it into an improvised solo, or even that you have the capacity to improvise at all, right? So that people who actually develop this improvisational skill become much more robust in their playing because they're able to access a bunch of different things kind of on the fly. And then if they do need to focus in on a specific thing and really figure out how to do, a certain riff or a certain type of picking or something like that, that they have this much more robust network of abilities as far as, understanding the chords that they're playing over, quickly switching between different types of picking based upon their improvisational skill set. And all of these things can then just be, okay, I have all these pieces. Now, if I'm really just focusing in on this specific thing, it becomes much easier to develop that. So I think this idea of creating purposefully varied practice scenarios And not just practice scenarios, but also purposely varied applications of a specific skill in order to get better at it is something that is really, really, really important, right? And I think that ties into this idea of metacognition, right? So meaning, I guess let's just say thinking about thinking, and also having skills about developing skills. So through these varied practice scenarios and this kind of flipping back and forth between abstract ideas and tangible practice, then ideally we develop both the sort of like tacit knowledge, meaning the inexplicable, difficult to articulate, subtle knowledge of actually having the skill, as well as this more explicit knowledge of saying like, oh, okay, like this is exactly what I'm doing. This is how I'm attempting to do it. And then based upon that, we can also become better at chunking patterns, right? So that we can say like, oh, I've seen this movie before. As a coach, you may have seen a certain type of emotional behavior from an athlete before, and you potentially recognize like, you know what, I've seen this movie before. I have some ideas of what I can potentially do. And I also recognize that this is a pattern of human behavior and isn't necessarily a reflection of myself as a coach. Similarly, let's say we can use a music example. If you're attempting to improvise a guitar solo over a chord progression, it's like, okay, great. I've kind of seen a movie like this before as far as what different notes potentially work over these chords. I have some ideas of certain types of licks that I've played in the past that I've worked to transition between different chords. I have an idea of, the type of melodic arc that I want this entire composition to follow. And based upon that, you're then able to tie everything together. And because you're able to see these patterns, it's easier for you to recognize nuances between them, as well as kind of like pull upon your past experience, right? So it's this kind of tricky thing of improved pattern recognition allows for more subtlety. Not because you're saying, oh, this is exactly like this previous scenario, I'm going to do exactly what I did before, but you don't have to process all of the information as new, right? That you have these hooks of previous patterns that you can hang previous ideas on and then iterate them as necessary, especially in a lot of these scenarios that we're talking about, right? In terms of coaching, each individual is going to be a little bit different in terms of their emotional reactions, in terms of their specific needs as far as, programming, exercise selection, energy systems development. All of these things are a little bit different, right? Every song that you play, if you're attempting to improvise, is going to be a little bit different. Every piece of software that you need to write is going to be a little bit different. But when you have these big chunks of ideas and things that you sort of know how they work and things that you've done in the past that have worked well, it's easier to look at something that seems very, very messy and complicated, and then it suddenly snaps into resolution, right? It's like, oh, okay, great. I can see exactly what these different pieces are. And then, based upon having hopefully a pretty good attitude about it, you're then able to start to attempt to do something. You're able to start, attempting to coach a person. You're able to start attempting to improvise some sort of solo or something. And then you're able to make adjustments on a nuanced level because you're able to easily see what the big picture is. And yes, of course, this can result in mistakes, but I think this ability of chunking is really what a lot of people are reacting to when they say that someone is talented or someone is skilled or something like that. Right? That people who are very, very good at using these different chunks of behavior that they've learned or quickly recognizing patterns and then reacting to them are the people who are very, very good at things, right? That someone who is a great player in a specific sport is better than most people at chunking a bunch of different patterns, right? They're able to look at the field and sort of see exactly where space is and sort of theorize what different players are doing, which directions they're going, et cetera. On a more granular level, they're able to, let's say, look at another player and what they're doing and recognize, okay, like their hips are in this position, their feet are in this position, their arms are in this position, which means that their next few steps are going to take them over here. Or if they're about to throw or kick a ball, they can anticipate what the trajectory of that ball is based upon seeing the position that they're in when they're about to hit it, right? So all these things from the sort of like micro level of being able to examine a specific player to the macro level of being able to see the entire field, and have very tangible chunks that they may not even recognize that they have, right? And then react to those things are what makes someone quote unquote great or really just better than other people, but better than other people at that. And then when you have these patterns that you can match, then that facilitates creativity simultaneously, right? Because you're able to then, again, sort of play in the nuances of these big chunks of behavior and patterns that you've seen before. And then being able to kind of like tweak one little thing here and there can make something much more creative and much more interesting than what people have done or seen in the past. Or in some scenarios, right, you're able to take these chunks that you've seen and combine them into totally new ideas, right? So if we think about not just necessarily a specific skill like playing a sport or playing a musical instrument, but let's just take some sort of invention, right? Or some sort of new technology, that often those come from someone having recognized certain patterns in different seemingly disparate areas and being able to tie them together in order to give, an entirely new way of doing something, right? And that this is often told as some sort of like, oh, the people in a certain industry are just kind of stodgy and set in their ways and they're not able to see the best way to do it. But I don't even necessarily think it's fair to give that type of negative explanation of why people don't figure things out that seem obvious in retrospect. I think rather it's just very, very difficult to make those kinds of connections. But then when someone has made it, we as human beings are extremely good at just sort of seeing that and then copying that new behavior and quickly internalizing that new insight. Right? I mean, we talk about this in terms of school and learning and all that kind of stuff, where it's like school takes the same amount of time as it used to take decades and decades ago in order for someone to graduate high school and move on to a more specialized degree or whatever they're going to do. But there's a lot more information that has been discovered since then. So what's going on is that, we're just skipping stuff potentially, but in reality, what's probably happening is that people are just getting better and better at having all these patterns that they're able to match. And then based upon that, through this new pattern matching and sort of like copying the chunks that other people have already developed and built upon, you're able to quickly internalize new concepts at, a much faster rate than people were before those concepts were chunked in that way. Similarly, in different industries, right? I mean, we see it all the time where someone has some type of insight, and then that facilitates just like a massive growth in a certain industry, right? And then based upon those new ideas, we're able to build new businesses on top of them. So, we can think about things. Let's use a technology example. So if we take something like Shopify, which facilitates people having their own online marketplace, right? Or their own online store, more accurately. They've essentially created a platform upon which other people can actually sell stuff, right? So they facilitated this massive explosion of smaller online stores existing, because those stores then don't have to actually rebuild the infrastructure in order to have their store. So we can see this at pretty much every layer of innovation, whether that's in culture or that's in technology or that's in learning or that's in music or whatever, that once someone has figured something out or learned how to do it, they potentially have either turned that into their own business that they can then sell to other people, like in the case of Shopify, or they've potentially just created a new chunk of understanding that someone else can apply and figure something out. An example of that would be some of the artificial intelligence that has, sort of entirely redefined how human beings think about and play chess, which is something I don't really know much about. But, if you listen to Magnus Carlsen, the world champion in chess, talk about it, he's actually studied the strategies that artificial intelligence has used in chess, and then that has leveled himself up in chess, right? So he is now actually taking patterns that have been recognized by machines and then applied them to his own pursuit of this specific skill. And so by constantly learning and stacking these new patterns and these new chunks, we're able to achieve new things. And then, based upon sort of stacking these other things ourselves, ideally, we continually are able, as individuals or as a species, to recognize these potential connections between different areas and ideally continue to learn, continue to develop our skills, and continue to make progress, right? And I do think this is something that people can kind of misconstrue as quote unquote guru behavior, and can give the illusion of someone being a quote unquote genius, etc. And like, yes, I definitely think that there are some people who are very, very special in certain areas and have a certain type of gift for recognizing patterns and reacting to them in areas that other people don't have the ability to do so, right? I mean, if we think about something like mathematics, there's clearly some individuals who are much better at theorizing and playing with these abstract constructions of math than others. And I do think it's a skill that can be developed, but that some people have brains that are designed essentially to, manipulate abstract symbols in a way that other people's brains are not. Similarly, if we think about something like soccer, there are some people like Leo Messi who, they clearly have some capacity to recognize patterns in human movement and then react to them that other people do not potentially have. And again, that's not to say that everyone can't get better and that everyone doesn't have the ability to improve based upon that, but that more importantly, right, these things that we see as this type of like guru or genius or whatever, like, yes, some people are sort of special, quote unquote, but that most people have this ability to recognize these chunks and these different patterns, and then to actually improve their ability to utilize them through this constant practice of bouncing back and forth between abstract ideas, attempting to apply them, and then using that as a constant, let's say, refinement of their own models of behavior in these different scenarios, right? And again, this is something that I personally have been working on both with myself in terms of developing my own skills with stuff that I care about, as well as really trying to figure out how can I make this happen better and more quickly for other people, whether that's employees or clients who I work with. And so, I'd love recommendations from folks listening. If anyone has any ideas on specific literature or ideas about how to translate the sort of like theory of learning into actual practice, because I think that's one of the biggest areas that we can improve in just about everything that we're doing, right? That a lot of problems have been solved. We know the answers in a lot of cases, and people have achieved incredible things, but that we're still not necessarily able to take this stuff in as information and then apply it even to skills that we're actively working on. So that's something I'm going to be continuing to look into, and hopefully this was helpful for anyone who enjoys thinking about learning and skill transfer and all that kind of stuff. Again, if you haven't already, I would definitely recommend checking out Scott Young's book on this, as well as, I've dug into some of the literature on teaching, right? Because I think that's an area where this has really been studied. And I don't remember the names of a bunch of the papers, but some folks have sent some papers into me that I thought were really interesting as well. So that's potentially worth digging into for some future content. So thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any recommendations for ideas on actually creating real skill transfer, as I would love to hear about it. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.